stuck between a libertarian and a Republican? Welcome to Publitarian Podcast.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. This is Ronald Johnson, Publitarian, coming at you again with another episode of Publitarian Podcast, and we are up to episode number 111. That's right, 111 of these bad boys. But without further ado, Mr. Announcer Guy, who do we have coming up on the show?
And now, Publitarian Studios is proud to present a keynote speaker, guest lecturer, and critically acclaimed author, ladies and gentlemen, Robert W. Ross.
That's right, I have the pleasure of having on Publitarian Podcast today renowned author Robert W. Ross. How are you doing today, Robert?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm doing just fine, and I gotta say, I'm just gonna fanboy here a little bit. It's really exciting to have you on the podcast. I am a big fan of your books.
Well, that's great to hear. I'm it's much better than the alternative because this would have been a completely different conversation.
I brought you on to tell you how much I think your writing sucks. And
oh man, another one.
Third one this week, right?
Exactly.
No, but seriously, I am digging these books. For those of you that don't know, Robert Ross is, I would classify you as a sci-fi and fantasy author. You may classify yourself as something else, but tell the people at home about who you are and what you do.
No, I think that pretty much captures it, at least for the next 6 months. I've written about 10 books, and they are all in the sci-fi and fantasy genre and subgenres. So I never realized how many subgenres there are until I started writing, and people were like, "Oh, well, that's space opera." I'm like, "Really? There's no singing at all," and showed my level of ignorance into subgenres. So I've learned a lot over the 10 years that I've been working kind of as a professional author. But I do have a book coming out, unless my beta readers tell me that I shouldn't release it, which hasn't happened yet, but always could. That is more of a paranormal romance, and we can maybe touch on that briefly somewhere along the way, because that's not my genre, but something weird happened, and I was like, well, if that kind of weird thing happened, then I guess I should probably at least try to write it.
Yes, we definitely need to touch on that then. Okay, that has piqued my interest. And as far as the books that are released, you have the Sentinels of Creation series. And this is, I would call this, I mean, I've read almost all of the books. Now, see, a true interviewer would just go ahead and fluff and say, "Oh yeah, everything was great." No, I've only got like 3 books in, but what I have read has been spectacular. And of course, audience, there are probably some spoilers ahead, unintentional, because I wanted to talk about the books, obviously, since I had you on here. Is that how you would classify that?
Sentinels? Yeah, Sentinels
Yes.
originally, and gets back to kind of subgenres. When it was originally published, it was published as something called urban fantasy, which is a subgenre where the fantastical exists around the mundane. So, like, Harry Potter could arguably be considered urban fantasy, and then it's been kind of renamed, or at least gone in parallel with another subgenre called contemporary fantasy, which I think actually is probably more accurate, because a lot of the urban fantasy books were set in urban areas, and my books are set really all over the place, but a lot of the action takes place in the current day. So it literally runs year for year from every year from, I think, 2015 to 2022. Although the 2022 one doesn't come out until 2022. So the events of the day are kind of referenced tangentially by the characters in the book. and so that's kind of why it falls into that contemporary fantasy area.
The writing on this, and it just sounds like I'm fluffing you up here, but the writing on this is spectacular. I mean, I've really enjoyed this. What I'm liking about the Sentinels books, and then the other one you have, which I would classify as sci-fi, maybe it's another subgenre, Paradigm 2045. What I like about these, they're not an easy read where I mean, like, you've dumbed anything down, but you do a really good job of going into the sci-fi and fantasy wonkery without getting like so bogged down into the wonkery that you can't tell the story. And I think that's an art in itself.
Yeah, it's it was surprisingly more difficult than I thought it was going to be because I was young, stupid, and ignorant, all three. It is and it's surprisingly it's easier in fantasy than it is in sci-fi, um, and they're almost kind of two sides of the same coin. So with fantasy, the biggest challenge for me anyway was creating a magic system that was self-limiting, or had limits to it, because otherwise you end up with um, characters that are very OP. I always harken back to the character of Superman, which is they it's so hard to create a good Superman story, and it used to be even harder before Kryptonite was around.
Yeah, because
And
he
so
can handle whatever.
right, he's a great guy. Doesn't cheat on his wife when he got married. He's basically a Boy Scout, and he is impervious to pretty much everything, and used to be everything. So then the author started experimenting with the various kryptonites, the green kryptonite, red kryptonite, etc. And you create those heroic flaws, or weaknesses. And the easiest ones, which I don't really use, but the easiest one is mana, right? So you run out of mana
Right.
and your wizard is like, oops, right? So a manaless wizard is just an old guy or gal with a staff that he tries to beat you over the head with. Um, so that's kind of the hardest part for me with that, and then creating complex magic systems where it becomes more work than it is fun. So I can give you a good example of a complex magic system that is fun. So I think Brandon Sanderson is a great author. I've met him a few times. In fact, I have an interesting Brandon story, which I can share just after this.
Okay.
But his Mistborn series has allomancy, which is a kind of a, a metal burning. You burn different metals, it gets different effects. And it's really complicated. You push this, you pull that. This thing makes you lighter. This thing makes time go faster. But he does it in such a way that you're able to keep track of it, for the most part. And then there's other authors who they get caught up in their own wonkery, and they're like, "Look at this chart I put on my wall that shows all the different things." I'm like, "Dude, it's like, oh my god, it looks like the Doctor and River Song's timelines. I don't need to understand this." Um,
Good
it's
point.
way too much work. Um, so so mine are kind of in the middle. I wouldn't say they're as elegant or as complex as Brandon's, because he's better at world building than I am. But that they're kind of the world in which my characters live. So my characters are kind of takes primacy, and then the world in which they live is really important but secondary. And then there's a lot of authors where their world building takes primacy, and their characters exist as a way of showing how the world's environment acts on people. So it's really just two different ways of writing. Neither one's better than the other, but I get a lot of feedback about how people enjoy the dialogue. And in fact, my voice actor Nick Podell, he gives me the greatest compliment. He says, "I can't wait to see when your books come, because it's like I get to meet all your friends again, and they're all in my head, and I get to talk with them." And so that's kind of the difference. With science fiction, it's the world's already there for you. So we already had a creator that built it. So I don't have to worry about building a world. It's more a matter of how do I get around the world constraints that uh, that that God created, right? So light
Hmm.
speed, there's a hard stop, right? So you got to get around that, because I didn't realize how big space was until I started writing science fiction. And I was like, I'm going to do this really smart. I'm going to use the exoplanets that the Kepler uh, telescope found, and I was like, wow, they're really far away. so so like
How'd they
even
get there?
I mean, I know it's like even Star Trek. I thought I was like, all right, I'm gonna use warp engines, and then I was like, I'm gonna kind of build off the same concept that Roddenberry used for warp engines, and then I was like, wow, warp engines are too slow. Um, so if you want to get even to the center of the galaxy, so then you have to come up with something else. So you have to find ways around the constraints that the physical world has for you. And that was a lot of work for the paradigm one. And I get it, like with the dialogue with one of the greatest compliments I've gotten from my sci-fi um, is that it's theoretically possible, but you don't get bogged down in it. So
Yeah, and that was my takeaway with the sci-fi end of it. And with the I see what you're saying with the fantasy realm. Guess people are a little bit more, well, the fans, I would say, would probably be a little bit more forgiving than the sci-fi fans, or is that not the case? Like if you
um,
don't get the science right, so to speak.
yeah, the science folks are really not. They're not mean, but they're not as forgiving, because it's science fiction. It's not magic fantasy, right? So it's like in the title. So I have this one guy who I really loved. His feedback was, he wrote me on Reddit uh, to explain to me how you couldn't use dark matter to open up spatial gates. And I was like, you're absolutely right. You can, but no one really understands dark matter. So since we don't understand it, and I need to get from point A to point B, there you go. But he was really very pleased with the my use of the Alcubierre drive, which is
Hmm.
there's an Italian guy named Alcubierre, and he created the theoretical warp engine of how it would actually bend space. The problem, as I mentioned, is once I used his science to use it in my books, then I realized that he was like, it's only going to go this fast, and I was like, well,
So you
that's not.
painted yourself in a corner.
Yeah, so I use the Alcubierre for kind of local high speed travel, but if you're going to
Right.
try to go real distances, then then it's the dark matter spatial gates. But again, like with fantasy, you want some limiting on it. So, well, I loved Stargate, but I thought that Stargate, was, and it was fine, because their point wasn't how do you get from point A to point B. It's like it's what happens at point B, right?
Once you get there, yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. But what I wanted to do is like, okay, so because in the third book of the series, it becomes really important. This becomes a really important thing, but is that the math in order to create a spatial gate from point A to point B is directly related to how far you're going, because you can't spatial gate through something big like a star or a planet or even a comet. So the further you go, the greater your chances that you're going to run into something that's going to kill you.
We
And
learned that in Star Wars.
exactly, yeah, exactly. So uh,
It's not like
and
dusting crops, boy.
and let me ask you, how many movies are there in Star Wars?
Oh no. There's 9?
Three. The answer is three.
Oh. Yes, yes, right. I see, you got me with the gotcha question. Yes. You're right. There are only 3. That's
We're
right.
gonna have to end this now because you answered them incorrectly.
Interview over. Bye.
I have a friend of mine who's an author whose name is Chris Kennedy, and he we have these little author, so they just pop up like in social media where just some conversation happens, and somebody made some snide remark about Star Wars, and then someone else was like, something bad should happen to Kathleen Kennedy, and they just were using her last name. And then Chris came by this thread, and it came in at the end, and he's like, "What did I do?" And I was like, "Different Kennedy, man. Just be glad you spell your first name with a C."
That's right. Yeah. K Kennedy. Nope, out.
Out.
Oh, that's funny. Well, since we're on the subject, I am assuming with your paradigm writings, I'm seeing more of a Star Trek fan than I am seeing a Star Wars fan. Is that accurate?
Um, no, I think that I'm fans of them for different reasons. The the science of Star Trek, I think, is genius. So what you're seeing in Paradigm is the science of Star Trek. You're also seeing the what I think is Star Trek's greatest gift, the original Star Trek's greatest gift, which is not to plug the title of my own second book, but you really see the humanity's promise in Star Trek. And I think I was talking about this at Dragon Con. I think that science fiction, more than almost any other genre, has a moral obligation to show what humanity should be and can be. And in Star Trek, there are two of my favorite. One of my favorite episodes is when Frank Gorshin, who played the Riddler, was in an episode, and it was Kirk was obviously, going to a planet to save the world, and these folks have been having civil war for as long as forever, essentially, right? And so Frank Gorshin is like his face is kind of binary. So half of his face is black and half of it is white.
Hmm.
And he's going on and on about how the others they're inhuman, they shouldn't live, and all this other kind of thing. And at the kind of climax of the story is Kirk is looking at me because I just don't understand why you guys can't get along. He says, Kirk, I just can't understand why you get along. And 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 and
Very good
Frank,
impression.
horrible at impressions. So just throw that one out. And so Frank Gorshin looks at him like Kirk's got lobsters growing out, falling out of his ears, and he goes, "What do you mean you don't see the difference between us?" He says, "I'm black on the right side. They're white on their right side." Um, and you look at it, and this gets to kind of one of the points that I've made in panels is that in that in that moment there was so much societal commentary densely packed into that moment while not beating you over the head with it because it
Hmm.
was just part of the story and it occurred organically. So in that moment, Roddenberry or whoever wrote that particular episode was being able to take, the least important part about these people, their art, their music, their interactions, their societal constructs. The least important thing about them was the pigmentation on one side of their face versus the other. And they both had the same pigmentation. It just was, and this was the genius of the commentary, was that it's not even like this person was white and this person was black, this one was orange, this one was yellow. It's they were the same color, they were just transposed on different sides of their face. So if you could go to war and kill people over something that stupid, then maybe we humans, we should get our shit together.
Yeah, for real. It's like that South Park episode where they finally get rid of Christianity and then the atheists all break into three separate factions and they all war with each other. I don't know if you're a fan or not, but that was like one of my favorite episodes. They go forward in time to 20 whatever and the atheists are warring with each other.
Yeah, I haven't seen that one, but I'm a fan of South. I'm a fan of the absolute uh, vast fields of no Fs. I'll say because I don't know how family friendly this podcast is. No Fs to give. There vast fields where they will not grow among the South Park creators.
No, that's fine. And switching gears a little bit, could you give my listeners a brief background of how you came to be an author?
Yeah, well, I started off really early as an author because I just loved writing. Unfortunately, I was a very, very bad writer. Um, so I wrote some short stories and I wrote some things in college, and I even wrote the novel that would someday become the foundation for Sentinels. Um, and the most generous way I could describe it is pretentious crap. Um, and I think that there's really two kinds of writers, authors. There's those that are born, and they're just gifted with the ability to see the world uh, and create their own world from what they have seen of it. And I think that that's true of a lot of different artistics. There's natural comedians who just see the world through a lens that makes them able to point out the ludicrousness. There's musicians, Mozart is a great example, right? So he was just born. He was born just with music leaking out of him.
Right.
Um, and so there's authors like that too. I'm not one of them. So I had to live.
I was waiting for you to categorize yourself as like
Yeah,
myself.
not me. So in the absence of having really lived experiences, I would create them out of whole cloth, and a born author can do that. What ended up with mine was it was obvious that it was artificial. And so to cover up for it being artificial, I used pretentiousness because that made sense. Um,
Mhm.
and so my early work was just really horrible and pretentious. And so I didn't write for really probably 20 years.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
I mean, I would write things for work for my day job, which was in consulting and technology. And I'd always have people go, "Damn, that was just a great email. I mean, you just got that point across. I could never write that email. I mean, you would. It's ridiculous how often I would get that. And it's like, and you motivated that team. You did that really well. And I was like, you should be a writer. I'm like, yeah, well, I'm not good at it. So so then about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to listen to my wife, who said, "You need to just stop and write something." So I wrote the novel that would become Sentinels of Creation, and she was sick with the flu, and I handed it to her, and she's like, "Oh, this is going to be the end of our marriage. I'm going to have to tell him he still sucks."
Oh no.
Um, and so she went up and she read it and came down, you know, like hours later, and she's like, "Against all odds, this is good."
Wow. Thanks, babe.
Yeah, that's my honey.
Man, well, so, sometimes our better halves are like the hype man that we need, and then other times I think they are that grounding that we need too.
Yeah, and that actually gets back to what I mentioned earlier, that Brandon story. So I met I have a special needs kid, and he was Brandon was visiting his special needs school as a friend, because his friend of his was a teacher there.
Hmm.
So I didn't know him from anything, right? And I had just kind of started out. I was working on Sentinels, and so I was coming in there to, I think it was like, adults, what do you do today at his school?
Right.
And I was talking what I did for a day job, artificial intelligence and digital marketing and a bunch of other techie stuff. And this guy was like, asking me questions about it, and is like, and he says, "Do you have any hobbies?" And I go, "Yeah, well, I'm working on this book and I'm writing it, and it's." He said, "What's it about?" I told him. He's like, "Oh, it's pretty cool." He said, and then he starts giving me some advice, and so I'm in my head, I'm like, "Who's this jackass giving me advice? Like, I didn't ask for advice." And 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 so I'm like,
Oh.
I'm polite. I'm like, "Thank you so much. That was a really good advice, because you know what? It was really good advice."
Okay.
And who
Uh,
knew, right? And then so
right.
like 2 years later, I'm at Dragon Con, and I run into him, and at that point, I had read his Mistborn, still didn't know what the guy looked like, and then I run into him, and I'm like, "Oh God, this is
This
is
is
the guy
advice
giving me
guy.
advice. This is advice guy." And so fortunately, he doesn't remember me from Adam. So I remember, but not that he would have made a connection, because all of that was internal monologue of me going, "How dare you give me excellent advice, person who is an excellent writer?" Uh, and I haven't published my first book. So I meet and I talk to him, and I was talking to him about Sentinels, and he's like, "Wow, that sounds really cool. It sounds familiar." I was like, "Well, this is what happened," and I tell him at the school. He's like, "Oh yeah," and so then.
So he did remember you after that.
Yeah, he remembered me after that. Well, I mean, how often are you at a special needs school where one of the kids' dads talks to you about being a writer? I mean, it's like a pretty niche thing. So,
Right, right. I
so
didn't know how lofty he was. I was just,
no, he's not. He's not lofty. Although he does have like assistants that have assistants now. So it's. I don't know whether he digs that or not, but I would hate it. But not that that's like an imminent problem for me. Is that my publisher tells me that I need to have three different assistants because I need to be shuttled from point A to point B because of the massive crowds. So that's not a problem. So he said, back to wives. He said there's three kinds of wives. He says there's the business wife, right? The wife who helps manage her business. There's the wife who doesn't get involved at all because she doesn't want that your business to encroach on their family. And then there was four. Then there's the critic, and there's the cheerleader. So the cheerleader is like, you go, honey, you're doing right. This is a great book, and then there's the critic, which is my wife, that tells you all the things that are wrong with your writing. And then there's the other two, and I guess the manager one can blend over. And I'm not going to
Right.
share which one his wife is. That's his story to tell. But my wife is absolutely the critic. But and I don't want this to be misconstrued. The work is so much better because of it.
Hmm.
You really need to have somebody, I think. So I have an alpha process. I do cold reads of my books once I'm done with them, to a small group of people, very small, of which my wife is one, and they tear it apart,
Right.
or they say it's awesome. So there is a chapter in Humanity's Promise, chapter 2021, I think it is, and I got done reading it, and everyone in the room was in tears, um,
Good tears.
moving tears. I mean, they
Okay.
were
Okay.
just like they were just like, that was the most beautiful thing you've ever written. Don't change a word, which happened once in 10 years, right? So, so there's that kind of transcendent joy that could occur too. But most often, it's it's stuff that needs to be cut. I had one scene in one of the Sentinels books after my daughter and I watched The Greatest Showman for like the third time, and I was like, you know what? You know what would be genius? What would be genius is if I had Kellen and Shannon, two of the main characters, act out a scene from Greatest Showman in the book. That would just be, and I wrote it and I was so happy with it. I was like, this is the best thing ever. I could hear the music in my head. I could see them dancing around. And I read it, and it's like the opposite of chapter 21 of Humanity's Promise. I got done and I looked up, and it was like
Crickets.
wide-eyed horror.
Oh.
And one of them said, you need to take that out. You need to burn every copy of that chapter, and it should never see the light of day. That
Wow.
was horrible.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Well, at least you know where you stand.
Oh, there's never not knowing whether you stand with the alphas. Uh,
And
yeah.
forgive my ignorance of the process. Is this like a typical thing for authors? Like you have your alpha readers, then betas, then.
No, I thought it might be, but it's not. As far as I know, no one else does the alpha. I'm sure someone else does, but I've never met anyone. And they all look at me the same way. I was like, why would you do that to yourself?
I think that's genius.
Well, it's certainly masochistic. So, it's something.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, you have to suffer some slings and arrows, I'm sure. But if it leads to a hopefully like a better product, I think that's a good idea.
I think you're right, and so I'm pretty happy with it overall. Although it does break the alphas, so I because they're friends, right? So they have to be really close friends or family. So
Right.
so I was sitting with one of them, and we were watching a movie, and she starts ripping into it, and I go, Alpha read much? And she looks at me and she goes, "Oh my God, I am." She's like, "You've ruined me. I'm constantly critiquing everyone's stuff."
Yep, this is not to inject myself into this, but this is very common in the music sphere as well. I'm some of my day job. I'm a musician, and it makes it very hard to go watch a band play. Or I've played in Christian music forever. It makes it really hard to go to like another church and watch it like a band perform. You're always sitting there going like, "Oh, I can't believe they did that. Oh man, look at that. Yep, typical." And it's like it's hard to be like in the moment and just enjoy what's happening. So yeah, that sucks.
Yeah, it's fun. It's just how that you get close to something and it just alters your perception of it.
But you can still enjoy fantasy and sci-fi and everything else. I'm assuming, or I hope.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I'm a huge fan. Although I will say that I have a lot less tolerance um, for stuff that I know the work that's been done before, and I know they could do better. And I see, I'm like, oh, that was clunky, and wow, I would have done that differently. And it's some of that's ego, and it's not good, and then some of it is just, gosh, I just want this to be better. But
Right.
then there's things that are just so good, like when I watched The Witcher as a fan, and I realized there were multiple timelines going on, which took me a while. I was like, oh my God, there's three different timelines. This is freaking genius. I want to start the whole thing over.
And then you can see it. Yeah, that's
Y-
cool.
Right, right.
So regarding the Sentinels of Creation series, like I said, I've already told people spoiler alerts ahead. I wanted you to get into a little bit about what the books are about, but I wanted to just share something amusing right before we did that because you were recommended to me by a friend, and so I start reading this book. I'm starting Sentinels of Creation, book one. Keep in mind, listeners at home, I am a Christian, but I start the book, I get to paragraph number one, and I start reading, and I start seeing like this thing where, Lucifer's talking to God, and I'm like, oh no, did I just wander into some like left behind Christian fiction and this person was trying to like evangelize me and oh no, I'm in a trap now. Um,
It's a
that was
trap.
not the yeah, that's right. It's a trap. That was so not the case. These books are so much more than that. But it starts off with that, and I think it paints a good picture. But when you first open it up, I was like, oh no, what did I get myself into? But that is not the case with these books, so I'm not scaring anybody away or trying to evangelize anybody. There's an element of that in there, but I'll let you speak about that since you wrote the books.
Sure. I've gotten that as well, and I'm on the fence as to whether or not if I were to do it over again, I would do it the same way. But the prologues for each of the Sentinels books are kind of take place for the most part in the spiritual realm or with celestial beings. So the tone of them are a little bit loftier, and there's some angels, there's the Creator and Lucifer and and their interactions, and it really came out of a painting I saw once, which was and I think a musician did a song too. I'm trying to remember the song. You probably remember it, but of God and Lucifer playing chess. Oh, it was Chris de Burgh. It was a song from Chris de Burgh.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
and so I had this image of God and Lucifer playing chess. And that ended up being, I think, in the prologue of the fourth book. But I'm thinking, okay, well, how do I get back to that? So in the first book, it really starts off uh, after the war in heaven, and Lucifer is being, like Milton's Lucifer, which is I'd rather serve in hell than or rule in hell than serve in heaven, and so he's thinking that he may have lost this battle, but he's going to win the war and he has no use for humanity, really hates them, and they strike a deal to to stay out of things, right? To just to let humans have their free will, and God being God knows that Lucifer is probably going to cheat. So they create these two characters to being sentinels of creation, one aligned with order and one aligned with chaos. And the archangel Raphael goes off to find his, and Asmodeus goes off to find Lucifer's. Um, and there, the easy way to describe it is think of like Neo in the Matrix, right? So if the world were the Matrix, these Sentinels would be kind of like Neo, in that they can't like break everything, but they can bend certain laws of creation.
They can
Um,
operate in the world, but there's a different set of rules for them, sort of.
exactly. And really the story follows the second Sentinel, as that power gets renewed in him, because the first one is like, I guess can't do this anymore.
Hmm.
And so the first book kind of revolves around that. And Kellen Thorne is who he is, and he's a diehard atheist. And I have a fan who created a shirt from a line in the book that there's nothing that ruins an atheist day than running into an archangel. And and that's kind of what happens, the story really spins off from there. And there's a huge, heroic arc that covers 7 books. The seventh one is going to come out in January, and that's the end of the series. Um,
I have some
and
catching up to do.
You do. You better get some reading. But there's nothing worse. The only thing worse than having to wait for a book, I think, is waiting for a book that never comes. So when I wrote the first book for Sentinels of Creation, it didn't say book one on it because I had no idea whether or not there'd be a book two. Because until the market says that you're not a horrible writer, you don't know really. Um, so then I was like, okay, people really like this book. I'm going to write a series. I hated it when some authors who remain nameless just didn't finish their stories, and so I'm left hanging forever. So I said, all right, I'm gonna write a book. There's going to be a book that comes out every year, if not sooner, but at least every year, and it will have an ending. And my original plan was for it to be 5 books, and about book 3, I was like, there's just no way. So then I made a deal with myself that it could be 7, but then that was absolutely it. So it is 7 books. The seventh book is actually twice as long as the first book. So I had a publisher say, "Well, why don't you just split it into 2?" And I was like, "Nope, that sucks uh, for readers." And another author friend of mine did that because his publisher told him to, and the he regrets it because he got a bunch of nasty reviews, which weren't really warranted. But people
Oh,
don't like thinking you're doing a cash grab, and they also don't want to have to wait for something they know you wrote.
oh,
And
you
they
know what? I
also
didn't even think about that aspect of it.
which one?
The cash grab, like you're splitting it up in two, so you sell 2 books instead of one. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, yeah, and that wasn't this person's motivation. It may have been the publisher's motivation, but and then you have to figure out a way of putting filler in to make the two. What was really something that was like 1.5 books into 2. So I didn't want to do any of those things. So a final sacrifice, the 7th book in the Sentinel series, is 170,000 words, 180,000 words. So it's a big book, but it's what it needed to be, and it's done. So the series is done except for beta. So that's Sentinels. It's that heroic journey of Kellen and his soulborn Shannon Thorne. She's from the 13th century Scotland. He's from 21st century Atlanta. And what could possibly go wrong with that?
Yeah, no, that sounds like a great match. Something that I saw, that a theme that was present in Sentinels and Paradigm was a love of whiskey, and I was wondering if you have that love, or was that just something that got worked into it?
I do love whiskey. In fact, you should feel horrible because the last podcast I did, someone sent me a bottle of whiskey that I was to drink on the podcast. So you're got to raise your bar now a
Yeah.
little. Uh,
Okay,
so
let me see what the budget will entail, and
but no, I'm obviously just teasing. But
of course.
uh, I do. I still love Scotch, but I can't afford the Scotch that I love, right? Because I really like good Scotch. So a good bottle of Scotch is a couple $100.
Yes.
Um, and up from there. So a really good bottle of bourbon, and I love the resurgence of bourbon. A really good bottle of bourbon is a lot less. And then I find these little gems. I write about Cooper's Daughter bourbon in my books.
That was the one I was going to ask you the name because I couldn't remember it. Yeah.
Yeah, Cooper's Daughter. It's a real distillery. It's owned by uh, two women, which is very rare in the United States, is to have a distillery owned by women. Her dad's a Cooper, hence the name Cooper's Daughter. So he makes the barrels. They're in New York. And I wrote to them, or I tagged them in an Instagram post, and they were like, "This is so cool. We just opened a bed and breakfast. Can we have some of your books? We could put them around the bed and breakfast." And I'm like, "Absolutely." But they're not super technical, and they couldn't figure out how to make my website work. And I was like, "I'll tell you what, I'll just give you a box of books, and you give me a box of booze." And they're like, "That's genius. Let's do that." And so I got this big box of spirits from them, ranging from bourbon to vodkas and infused vodkas, and this absolutely killer Bloody Mary, and then this margarita with rhubarb in it. And so I totally came out better on that deal. And I actually filmed myself doing an unboxing on Instagram, and I was just like, "This is the best day ever." So I lined up
love
all
that.
the bottles. So if any, I would encourage you guys to go check out my Instagram. It's at Ross Author on Instagram, and you can find that video. They're a small family owned business. Great products, great people. Old York Farm is the name of their website, and Cooper's Daughter is their line of spirits, and they will ship anywhere that they're legally allowed to. It's great stuff.
And again, that's Cooper's Daughter. And they also do vodkas and other things, correct?
Yeah, they do all sorts of things, seasonal things. And I had this one of the things they sent me was a currant liqueur, like currants, like grapes.
Oh,
Oh
right.
my God, it's so good. All their stuff is just amazing.
And we are going to cut it right there. There is a lot more to this interview, so this will be part one. Robert and I had such a good time talking. The podcast interview went way longer than either one of us anticipated that it was going to. So that's going to be part one. So stick around next week when I'll be bringing back part two. We'll touch on a little bit about bourbon and spirits again, and then going into Robert's other works and stuff that he's done. And we have a lot of fun. And so we'll see you guys here next week on the next edition of Publitarian Podcast. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to Publitarian Podcast. Copyright 2021.